Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
Times as you're writing a lesson, there's a song that's bouncing back and forth in your mind the whole time that you're going over the lesson, and that was the song that was bouncing through my mind. And I called Zach and I said, hey, can you lead this song? He said, well, I don't know it. And I said, well, lead it anyway. And you did a fine job, Zach. I know how hard that is to take a song that you barely know or don't know and trying it out, especially on a Sunday morning when we're all here. And but you did a great job, Zach. I appreciate it. And it really comes down to the words of that song. What a wonderful evolution of life as we start out all selfish, all of self and none of thee. But then we ultimately grow to that point where it's not just some of self and some of thee, or less of self and more of thee, but ultimately none of self and all of thee. What a great message that is as we look this morning at probably one of every preacher's most favorite topics, the one that confirms many fears about people in the church, it seems like, and it's the topic of giving, because we know that the preacher's only doing it for the money, right? That's not the preacher's worst subject. There's other ones, but a lot of times we don't like to preach on giving because we feel like we're trying to be money grabbers. And sometimes as preachers we get accused of that enough as it is, and so we're hesitant or skeptical to preach on it. But the simple fact is, when we're talking about the church, we're talking about what Christ has done for us and what God has done and what God requires, identifying the church and what Christian living is. Any preacher or elder or Christian would be committing spiritual malpractice if we didn't at least talk about the fact that we must give, if we fail to teach on the contribution. Years ago, I was teaching in a Bible class, and one of the teenagers said to me, he said he was working on his truck, and he was, as teenagers were doing at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, he said, I was chopping the top on it and dropping it down, and, he was doing all this, and he said, for 1 week's communion, I could finish my truck. And I said, what? He said, yeah, for 1 week's communion, I could finish my truck. I said, oh, you mean the contribution? Well, yeah, the money that we give at communion. And so we went into a long lesson about the difference and the distinction between the communion and the contribution. We've just spent the last month talking about coming to the table and gathering with Christ at the communion, at this opportunity to share with Christ this bread and this cup that he gathers with us. Remember that promise, I will not drink of this cup until I drink it anew in the kingdom of God with you. And so there's a special moment when we gather around and we commune with Christ at the Lord's Supper. And what a wonderful opportunity we've had to look at this with Corey and some of the lessons that I've done to look in depth. I hope that it gave you a deeper appreciation for the Lord's Supper, for communing with Christ. But in an effort to continue talking about the church and identifying the church and how the church worships, we're going to turn our focus from the Lord's Supper or the communion to the contribution, which obviously is something distinct from the Lord's Supper. Sometimes you'll hear someone say, separate and apart from the Lord's Supper. We also find this as a convenient opportunity to pass the collection plate or something like that to identify the distinction between the two. And certainly we as Christians need to understand that distinction. But that's not all we need to understand about the contribution. Personal sacrifice of our personal resources to worship God has been a staple of faithful worship since the days of Adam and Eve. Even Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4 were offering the fruit of the fields and the fruit of their flock toward God, recognizing that personal resources, the sacrificing of the personal resources, was part of what God required even then. And I would say God continues to require personal sacrifice that plays an important role in faithful living in the church today. In the New Testament, it's variously known as the collection, or as the participation, or as the ministry. Those three words are used to identify the contribution which we give upon the first day of the week, the collection that is taken together as the church. The idea of collection is used in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2, that collection be made, and it actually comes from the word logos. It's logia. But the root is logos itself, word or message. And so as we are giving our collection, as we are giving a message back to God who has given us those things. Or another word that is used to describe the collection or the contribution is the koinonia, or the participation. Or the other word that is most commonly translated from koinonia is fellowship. That we together are putting together our deeds and our resources so that we may help the church fulfill its purposes. And then the last word that is used in the New Testament to refer to that contribution is diakonia, where we get deacon. And it's the idea of ministry. As we give, it is part of our ministry towards God. And certainly as we look at these words, they clue us into their purpose. It is a collection, a gift, a fellowship, a participation, a ministerial service. It is the natural outgrowth of our understanding of what God has done for me. Paul clearly calls for that collection in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2, verses 1 and 2, concerning the collection for the saints, as I delivered to the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. It is a commandment from God concerning that collection. There was a need for those who were in famine in Judea, that to alleviate that famine, those in Macedonia, those in Corinth, those in Achaia were going to give their money, and it was going to be sent for famine relief in Judea. Paul says, between now and then, you need to make your collections upon the first day of the week. I think part of that had to do with the convenience of it, that it was the day that they were already coming together. But I also think that it has to do with the fact that giving your contribution is worship toward God. Sometimes we don't think of it as a worship, but it is worship. Just like when we sing songs, they're songs and words of worship. Just like when we partake the Lord's Supper, and it is a memorial or commemoration of the death of Christ, it is worship toward him. When we put that check or put those dollar bills or whatever it may be in the plate, that is worship toward God. We often refer to them as the 5 acts of worship, and certainly in that act, or in those acts of worship, is sacrifice. Since the church's very inception, since its first day, that personal sacrifice has been an integral part of Christian living. The money collected each week helps the church pay its bills, support ministers and missionaries, assist people preparing for the ministry, helping those who are in need, and sending the light of the gospel into the world of darkness. And the church is able to do that because of the generosity of members. For the Christian, though, the question isn't, should I give? The question is more, how should I give? Our contribution reflects our faith, our willingness to participate with God in changing the world. It also reveals our heart of love and compassion, generosity, responsibility. What you give, how you give, reveals a lot about you. This morning I want to look at an example, one of the great examples of giving in the Bible. And ironically, it's not coming from the New Testament, but from the Old Testament, from the beloved King David, the most popular king of all of ancient Israel history. In fact, all of Israel's history. They still venerate King David. And why not? He was a man after God's own heart, the Bible tells us. And yet there's a moment in David's life, every now and then, there are moments that are filled with darkness. For example, when he looked at Bathsheba with lust, ultimately committed adultery, and then murder in order to cover it up. David was not a perfect man, and there was one instance toward the end of his life as he's looking out and looking at the kingdom and seeing how many people are there, And he starts to question, I wonder how powerful I am. I wonder how big my army is. I wonder how big my nation is. And so he tells his general, it's time for us to count the people. And his general wisely says, I don't think that's a good idea. Because your power and your strength lies with God, not in the number of people that you have. And David insists, you've got to number these people for me. And so they begin counting the people. And you know what happens? God becomes irritated and irate with David to the point that he sends an angel, and a death angel, a plague into the people. And people are dying as a result of David's foolishness. And for a moment, God stays the hand of the angel. The angel, you picture this warrior with sword in hand, and he's chopping down people left and right, and he comes up to what will be the city of Jerusalem. It's not the city of Jerusalem yet, but he comes up to this area, to Mount Moriah, Mount Zion. And there on the top of the mountain is a threshing floor owned by a man named Ornan. And he stops the angel right there at the threshing floor of Ornan. And then God sends Gad the prophet, not to be confused with Gad, one of the sons of Jacob. But Gad the prophet comes to David, and God commanded him, you tell him to go up and build an altar, the threshing floor of Ornan. And I will stop that angel. And so David receives this mission from Gad, and he goes, and as he's approaching the house of Ornan, it says Ornan's there with his son. He looks down and he sees David coming. What does it take to get a king to visit your home? That's what Ornan's thinking. What is causing him to come here? Am I in trouble? Am I being rewarded for something? Am I receiving some gift? And he runs out and he meets David, and he says, why have you come here? What avails me this great privilege of having the king come to my home? And David tells him, I've got to stop this plague. I've got to stop the death. And God has told me the way that I'm going to stop this death is to build an altar on your threshing floor. I need to buy your threshing floor then, right here, right now. And Ornan, who is just overwhelmed by the privilege of being with a king, and that God would even think of him, says, well, you can have it. You don't have to buy it. You can have it. In fact, I give you not only the threshing floor, I give you the sledge, the tools that were the machinery that would thresh the wheat itself and grind it down. I give you the oxen that pull the spindle around. They'll be your sacrifice, and the yoke that is on them, that can be your firewood for the altar. I will give it all to you. David knows the importance of this sacrifice. David knows that God is holding back the angel for only a short time, and in order for it to cease completely, he has to sacrifice. And he says to Ornan, no, I cannot take it. I cannot. I have to buy them. And he makes this great statement, I cannot give God something that does not cost me something. I cannot give it if it doesn't cost me something. In this context, I want to notice just a couple of things about giving. The first one is the idea that giving is commanded. Just as here in verses 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 18. I think I forgot to actually announce that. We're in 1 Chronicles 21 and verse 18. The angel of the Lord had commanded Gad to say to David should go up and raise up an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Follow Zach's lead here. So David went up as the Lord, at the Gad's word that was spoken in the name of the Lord. And Ornan, of course, was threshing the wheat. God commanded Gad to go and tell David, this is what must be done. The collection that is gathered by the saints upon the first day of the week is the product of a commandment of the Lord. It is gathered from personal sacrifice and the willful giving of one's resources back to God who gave them, as we often say. The history of giving in such a way goes back. We see it first in Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel giving of their flocks and of their fields. But each momentous event throughout the Old Testament, especially throughout the book of Genesis, there's worship that is given to God by sacrifice. For example, God calls Noah to build this ark, and of course that saves mankind. In Genesis chapter 8, when the ark finally comes to rest and God opens the door, the first thing that they do when they come out is they build an altar. Genesis 8 and verse 20 says, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar." Abraham, after he's coming back from the battle with the kings of the plains, against Chedorlaomer and so forth, in which he saved Lot. On his way back, he meets Melchizedek, who is a priest of the Most High. And he says, "Blessed be God the Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands." And Abraham, or Abram at that time, gave him a tenth of everything, Genesis 14 and verse 20. When they cross over the Red Sea, they begin worshiping God. When they cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land, they begin worshiping God. Worship was at the forefront of Israel's life. And in that forefront was the sacrificing of personal resources toward God as commanded. Christians today follow the pattern of history. We give as God has commanded. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, notice it says that each one must give. That's the imperative. That's what we call a command. We give today because God has commanded it. But not only is giving commanded, giving is principled. It has to have some principles behind it. And I want to relate three of them to you that I see in this context of David making that great statement when he says, "No, but I will buy them for a full price, for I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." Verse 24. Giving is principled, and one of the first principles is that our giving must be costly. It must cost us something. David sought to buy the field at fair market value. Ornan offered the field, the animals, and the equipment as a gift to the king, but David refused Ornan's generosity. "I will not take for the Lord what is yours." I'm not going to take yours and call it my sacrifice and give it to God. It's not my sacrifice. It was not Ornan's foolishness that started the plague. It was not Ornan's foolishness that was causing people to die. And David was keenly aware of that fact. I cannot take what is yours and offer it to God as if it were mine when it costs me nothing. Our contribution should be a sacrifice. It should cut into our resources. Under the old law, their tithing system served as a reminder that the work of God took precedence over everything else. Under the Old Testament system, it was before I paid my bills, before I fed my children, or before I paid my mortgage, I gave 1/10 of all that I had to God. That was the lesson of the tithing. Those gifts were used to maintain the tabernacle, the worship of God, and support the priests and the Levites in their work for God. Too many today fail to understand those concepts. I realize we do not tithe today. At no point does God say, you take a 10th part and write it off, and that's your tithe. We give as we have been prospered. But do not the principles continue to be the same? That God deserves what I have before I pay my bills, before I feed my children, and before I pay for my shelter. Too many contribute to God's cause what is left over at the end of the month. as the popular song says, there's often too much month at the end of the money. And if I'm only given what I have left over, a lot of us will give zero. Because we don't have much left over at the end of the month. But our contribution to the Lord is not something that we give out of my leftovers, not after I've seen to my earthly needs, then I can give to God. Faith, true faith, gives to God first, trusting that all my needs will be taken care of because I've given to him first. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. God will help meet my needs if I first meet his needs. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33. In 2 Corinthians 8, in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, Paul would say, and beyond their means of their own accord. Talking about the Macedonians, commending them to the Corinthians. Corinthians, look what the Macedonians did. It was a test of their affliction. Out of their extreme poverty, not just poverty, Paul uses the adjectives here to describe that this is more than just mere poorness. This is extreme poverty. And he says they gave by their means and beyond their means. They gave what they could afford to give and then gave more. Our contribution has to cost something. I'm reminded of Jesus watching the people giving at the collection box. And he sees the widow come in, and she drops her 2 mites in. Jesus says to his disciples in Mark 12 and verse 43 and 44, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. David says, I can't offer something that does not cost me something. In just a little bit, after we've had our communion, we're going to have an opportunity to give to God. And we need to give not out of our abundance, like everybody else was in the first century. We need to give out of a sacrifice that it is going to cost me something. Secondly, though, our contribution needs to be done willingly. The principled contribution is done willfully. David had the opportunity to take Ornan's offer, but he wanted to give. He wanted to give himself. In one of his Psalms, David would ask, what shall I render unto the Lord for all of his benefits toward me? Psalm 116 and verse 12. What shall I offer? What shall I give? David understood that there's a relationship of what God has done, all of his benefits toward me. What shall I give back to God? Surveying his life, David recognized the hand of God throughout his life. God's blessings shaped his heart, wanting him, causing him to want to give. That's the way that we should give, in a similar way. The blessings that we experience in this life should shape our hearts to want to give, to desire to give. Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship, the ESV has. Sacrificing ourselves to God is our spiritual, or possibly a better translation here, reasonable. Based upon reason. Well, what reason? Because of what God has given already. It is your reasonable worship or service unto God. It's the rational response to what God has done for us. In 2 Corinthians 8, 12 and 3, or 8, 2 and 3, he says, beyond their means. They gave beyond their means, But notice the last phrase there. By their own accord. Paul was not there, passing the plate and looking at the money and said, well, that's not quite enough. We'll pass it again. And we'll keep passing it until there's enough in the plate. Paul is not prodding them. The elders of the church at Corinth are not prodding them. It's the faith and the love that they have for God that they can't give enough. I want to give and give and give till it hurts. I want to give something that's going to cost me something. I want to give it. It's not just that I'm giving begrudgingly. He would say in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 11 and 12, so now finish doing it as well. It says you've pledged to do it over a year ago. Now finish doing it so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. For if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. That readiness, that willfulness. I don't give because I have to give. I give because I want to give. I give as the response to what God has done. And I give until it hurts me. And I cry because I cannot give more. And then I give more anyway. Because I want to. Because it is an honor toward God. The attitude behind our gift is as important as the gift itself. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. That's what that statement means. I give because I want to. And then I give more. And then I see if I give any more, it's going to hurt my finances. But I give it anyway because I can't help myself, because I want to give this to God. And then thirdly, we give purposefully. David had in his heart a single purpose. This is to honor God. God stayed the plague, but David was told to sacrifice to stop it permanently. Since the plague was a result of his self-reliance, it was his burden to do what had to be done in order to stop it. By honoring God in the sacrifice, he turned his self-sufficiency into a reliance on God. Today we honor God as we give to him with purpose. That means that we know what we can afford, and we know what we can't afford, we know our finances, and we choose purposefully, here's what I'm giving. And I'm giving it for this purpose, to honor God, to seek to honor him with all that I have. The Bible teaches us that when we start giving to God, that we cannot outgive God. Malachi 3 and verse 10, he says he will open the windows of heaven. He will shower us with such blessings that we can't even contain them. We cannot outgive God. So what we do is we find pleasure in giving all that we possibly can and then some. On the first day of the week, each one of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper. When you look at your personal finances, you have to make this decision. It's not the elder's job to come to you and say, okay, it's another year, you got a raise last year, you need to up your contributions. It's not the elder's job to have to come and tell you that. It's not the preacher's job to come and have to tell you, assess your finances so that you are giving as you have prospered. This is an action between you and God, and it is a reflection of your faithfulness to him. Give as you have prospered, he says. Or in 2 Corinthians 9:7 again, each one must give as he has decided in his heart. There is a purpose here. David looks at the threshing floor of Ornan. He looks at the oxen that he's giving and all the tools and all the equipment, and he assesses its value at 600 shekels of gold. And David pays it purposefully because I'm going to give this to God. Our giving should never be an afterthought. It should never be a habit any more than singing a song of praise to God is an afterthought or a habit. We wouldn't do that. Prayer is not rote memorization. The Lord's Supper is not just motions that we go through, and neither should our giving. Our giving should be determined, a determined response for his benefits, a worshipful act toward God for all that he's given to me. It is a joy to give. To determine to give to the Father who loves us, and he proves it repeatedly every single day. It's good to be reminded and to remind others of our opportunities to give. That our personal sacrifice to God, who sacrificed his own Son for us, that's the meaning of our collection. With the money that is collected, the church then is able to fulfill its mission. And every Christian can be a part of that mission. How we worship helps to identify the church of Christ. And giving a costly, willing, purposeful contribution is a vital part of that worship that identifies who we are. And in just a few moments, we will be given that opportunity to give to the Lord's church. But like the Corinthians, we must give ourselves first to the Lord. 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 5. That's why they were able to give out of their deep poverty. That's why they were able to give beyond their means. The Macedonians, I said Corinthians. The Macedonians were able to do that because they gave themselves first to the Lord. And so that's the question this morning. Have you given yourself to the Lord? Yes, I mean by that in its initial stages, the idea of obeying the gospel, that you give your life to God as that living sacrifice, obeying the gospel and being baptized for the remission of your sins. Yes, that is part of giving yourself to God. And you say, well, I've done that. Well, if you haven't done that, obviously you have an opportunity, and when we sing the invitation song, to rectify that. But you say, I've already done that. But the giving of our lives is that continual, every day, beyond the waters of baptism. If you're baptized on a Sunday, it means that you still have your life given to him on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, Friday and Saturday, and the rest of your life. That is giving ourselves. And as you give, you're giving your time. You're giving your resources. You're giving your money, your dedication, and your commitment to God. And maybe you're looking at your life and you're saying, I've fallen short of that. I need to come back to a true giving unto God. I need to come back to a faithfulness, or maybe gain a faithfulness. I've been going through the motions, and I'm ready to give my heart to God first and allow my resources to follow. This morning, if you have a need, to respond to his invitation, whether it's for the obedience to the gospel that you may be his, or to give your life back to him that you've been holding back and onto your own, we're ready to receive you this morning if you'll respond while we stand and while we sing.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in his grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood